body contact.
But the mind has come into play there.
Okay, the mind comes into play, and it'll also pick up on that contact and maybe enjoy it because it's a pleasant feeling. But then suddenly it gets the thought, this is a snake. Okay, and then fear arises and aversion towards that touch.
And that's craving.
Let's not bring craving in here. Just say that there's, because I want to come to your question. So there's this, okay, there's the contact, fear, aversion arises, and accompanying that fear and aversion, there'll be an unpleasant feeling. Mm-hmm. That unpleasant feeling, it's based upon the cognition, that's a snake, and then it's based upon the fear and aversion. But it's not, that feeling is not directly arising from the touch sensation. Right. The touch sensation is just a touch sensation which brings up its feeling, which will be a pleasant feeling if it's a smooth, silky piece of cloth.
So I guess my question is that going back to the sensation that would be pleasant or neutral or maybe disagreeable if the fabric is rough, the mind is involved making a judgment there, isn't there? I mean, so what is the feeling that has to do directly with the sense person?
The feeling that arises directly from the touch sensation is occurring at a very, what we call a very primitive or primordial stage or fundamental stage in the development of the conscious process. This is before any kind of recognition takes place. It's just the sensation, and a feeling arises based on that sensation. But then when cognitions or identifications take place, that is where new feelings enter based upon or to the kind of identification or cognition that takes place. If one recognizes, it's a nice piece of silky cloth, then there'll be continued enjoyment of the pleasant sensation. If suddenly one thinks, that's a snake, then there's fear arises, and then there's unpleasant feeling, which is conditioned by the fear, and that fear is conditioned by the wrong cognition. But that unpleasant feeling, it's not directly based on the touch sensation of the cloth. If it's a rough piece of cloth, then a painful bodily feeling will arise.
Thank you.
But if it's a doctor is giving one an injection to get rid of an illness, then there's a painful feeling, but one recognizes that he's injecting medicine that's going to help me get over this illness, so then there'll be a pleasant mental feeling. Okay, one more quick question. You used to come here a long time ago, didn't you?
Ante, I have a question regarding following her question and your explanation. You talk about if I touch, strictly touch the contact of the cloth, is pleasant and pleasant, pure of that. Yeah. But then you're talking about the fear and the subject and the object of a snake. I thought that is our mind is already goes through several layers of process. Yeah. Because the first you have feelings, contact with the blanket. Yeah. And then you create the craving, and then you start another process. It creates the mind and the mind object. The object is we created the fear and the snake is so beyond the first direct contact. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, that's all I want to clarify. Thank you.
Okay, is it a simple question?
Actually, not a question.
Oh, okay.
It's more an experience as I'm sitting here, and I think that we meditate for 50 minutes. Yeah. And what we need to do is remain in that meditation mode of observance. Yeah. Because we're sitting here trying to understand intellectually alone. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
Because the Buddha didn't read books. He saw this through meditation.
Yeah.
So all of this will come together.
Yeah.
Take it in intellectually, but don't.
Yeah.
And then meditate, and you will see.
Yeah, this will
and
become,
understand.
it becomes clear through meditation. Okay, but let us move on now. Okay, now we come to the next section of the discourse, and this is a very important section. And this is what I gave it the title called The Demonstration of Not Self. So this is one of what I find to be one of the clearest arguments, you could say, in the Buddha's discourses on one of the clearest arguments for the principle of non-self. And it's also one of the clearest expositions, I would say, of what is the meaning of anatta, of non-self. Because often in popular books, not only popular books, but even sometimes learned, scholarly books on Buddhism, it's said that the Buddha teaches that there is no self. And I don't like to formulate the doctrine of anatta, non-self, in that way. Because it could lead to misunderstanding. Like if you say that you don't have a self, what have I been doing the last 35 years or so? You know, here I was, I've gone through 70-something years of life, and suddenly I'm told that that self doesn't exist. Complete puzzlement. Rather, what I say is that what the Buddha speaks often, he'll actually use the word self in a positive way. And so what I've been able to see, I haven't really investigated this at length from the discourses, from the suttas, but there are, I say, two domains of discourse in the Buddha's teachings. One domain we'll call the ethical domain, and the other we call the contemplative or philosophical domain. When the Buddha is speaking within the ethical domain, he'll use the word self positively. For example, he'll say, it's by yourself that evil is done. By yourself that good is done. You yourself must make an effort. No one can purify another. Or you yourself know whether you have been acting properly or improperly. Or he'll say that it's the self that has to be understood. You have to understand yourself. So in all those types of expressions, we see that the Buddha is using the word self in order to inculcate personal responsibility. Again, we have the famous discourse, or part of actually it comes in the Parinibbana Sutta, where the Buddha says, be an island unto yourself, be a refuge for yourself. Don't depend on any external refuge. So again, in this situation, in order to stress the importance of personal responsibility for one's behavior, for one's mental development, the Buddha will use the word self in a positive, affirmative way. But this doesn't mean that he's affirming the existence of what we would call the substantial metaphysical self. So what the Buddha is rejecting by the teaching of non-self is the reality of a substantial, permanent or persistent core of personal identity. A substantial, persistent core of personal identity. And the way the mind works, what the approach the Buddha is taking, is to take first the whole domain of experience, which is distinguished into these 6 sixes. And whenever anybody comes up with the idea that I have a self, that there is some reality, substantial reality to this sense of I, they will, when they're seeking to give some content to that sense of I, the sense I am, they'll identify it with some concrete element within experience. And when they identify the sense I am with some factor of experience, then that factor of experience is what is identified as the self, myself, what I really am. So maybe we could illustrate it this way. Okay, so here we have the ordinary ordinary person. Have I discovered a new talent? Okay, the ordinary person who has this idea that arises just sort of naturally in the back of the mind that I am. Always we're thinking, I do, I speak, I do this, I do that, I have such qualities, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm a monk, I'm a layperson, I'm Chinese, Korean, Caucasian, African, American, Hispanic, whatever. But always what lies behind all of these identifications, I am. And then sometimes one starts to ponder, what am I really? What is this I that's always appearing? And then when one starts reflecting, one identifies that I with something. Usually the Buddha will use the scheme of the 5 aggregates. I am bodily form, or feeling, or perception, or mental formations, or consciousness. Other times he'll use the 18 elements, the 6 internal sense bases, the 6 external bases, the 6 types of consciousness. And here he uses the 6 senses. So I identify something, this is what I really am. And that becomes the idea of myself, the true self. So it could be identified directly with any of these elements, or just considered as something in the background, the self that possesses all of these factors. But there's some idea of the self which is now crystallized through identification. And now for the Buddha, that is sort of the source of the problem, that identification of something with myself. And so to open the door to liberation, what the Buddha has to do is to break that identification. And the way he breaks that identification usually is just with a simple exposition that the 5 aggregates or the 6 sense spaces are not mine, not I, not myself. But here, in this sutta, he uses a very systematic method of argument. It's almost, we could say, like a precursor, a forerunner of the kind of arguments that one finds in maybe later Buddhist philosophy, like Nagarjuna, the founder of the Majjhima school, where you take a position, then take another position that you hold. When you're arguing with somebody, you take a position that he holds, that he'll affirm, then you take another position that he'll affirm, and then show that the 2 positions that he's holding to are contradictory. So one has to go. And so in this case, we could run through the passage. This is on section number 10. So suppose someone says, the I is the self. And so the Buddha says, that is not tenable. That's not valid. That's not acceptable. Okay, now he gives the reason. The rise and fall of the I are discerned. Okay, this is what one can detect. I mean, it's rather difficult to detect this in ordinary meditation, but when the meditation builds up intensity, then one can experience the constant arising and passing away, even of the sense faculties, the sense bases. But usually, what we experience of rising and passing away would be more clearly the objects or the feelings. But let's just continue with the I. Okay, so the rise and fall of the I are discerned. So we think of the I as being a stable or persisting entity, but when one pays close contemplative attention to the I, one sees the I is constantly arising and passing away. And so what we normally call the I is really a series of events, not a stable entity, but a series of I events arising and passing away. Trying to think of a good analogy for this. Like one analogy that comes to mind is a stream in which the water is constantly changing, but that's not as good analogy as... Maybe a good analogy would be yeah, but I want something which changes not continuously, but in discrete oh, that's it, exactly, that's it. It's the... I don't know whether they make movies in this way anymore. With the film, the strip of film, which turns around, yeah, so you have distinct frames which are passing by so quickly that it looks like the person is there, maybe extending his arm or reaching for his gun, pull out and shoot. It's a gangster movie or a romance. But then if you look at the film strip, it's just, or if you slow down the projector, then it turns into distinct frames. Or even like the comic strip, the Mickey Mouse comics, they're just distinct. Each one is drawn differently, but with a little difference. So when you run them by very quickly, it looks like Mickey Mouse is rowing a boat or whatever. Okay, so with the eye, it's similar. It's momentary frames of the eye arising, passing away, arising and passing away. Okay, now the person that the Buddha is speaking to would have to affirm that the I is arising and passing away. That's clearly discerned. Okay, and now, but the person wants to say the I is myself. But now what the Buddha says, since the rise and fall of the I are discerned, if you say the I is self, it would follow my self rises and falls away. And that is why it is not tenable, not justifiable, not reasonable for anyone to maintain the I is the self. And thus the conclusion follows, the I is not self. Okay, let's unpack this here. Because from the argument we could see, what is the essential quality of the self that the Buddha is arguing against, and why he frames his teaching in this particular way. From the fact that the idea of self and the idea of arising and passing away are incompatible, we could see that what underlies this concept of self that the Buddha is rejecting is permanence or persistence. That is, the idea of self as being rejected, it's not what we would call the everyday personality. It's not our everyday sense of personal identity. It's not the empirical personality or the empirical person, but it's the notion of a persistent, substantial core of personal identity. And if there were a substantial core of personal identity, it would have to persist either permanently from life to life, like the Atman of the Brahminic systems, or it would be a self that persists through the course of life and then is annihilated at death. But what the Buddha teaches is that all of these factors of experience arise and pass away, and therefore they cannot be identified as the self in the metaphysical sense. But it's not just the rejection of a metaphysical idea, because nowadays, how many people subscribe to the metaphysical idea of a metaphysical self? You would have to go to maybe the graduate students at the philosophy departments at Yale, Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, ask them, do you believe in a metaphysical self? Probably 0.001% would say yes. But what I would say is that it's what takes place at a deep level of our ordinary mind is that we identify these factors of experience as being mine, I, or myself. And because we identify them as myself, then there sets in the clinging to them. And it's that clinging to them that for the Buddha maintains the cycle of birth and death, samsara. And so what has to be eliminated is the clinging to the idea of a self, the clinging to the factors of experience identified as being myself, the self. But I should also add that in the Buddha's time, I'm saying today, not many people might subscribe to the idea of a permanent self. But in the Buddha's time in India in the 5th century, this was the big topic of discussion amongst the philosophers and ascetics. What is the real self? What is the true everlasting self? And so they came up with many different theories, philosophies, systems, and at the core of all of these systems, like the sun at the center of the solar system, was the idea of the self. And what the Buddha did was to sort of turn this whole mode of speculation on its head by saying that you guys are all wrong, that this idea of self is just a fantasy, a delusion, a projection of the mind. And by doing that, he affected what you might call the Copernican revolution in Indian philosophy. And it seems that idea of that there must be a self, it's still quite widespread in the Indian mind. Maybe not among some of the newly educated class, but I remember back in 1975, I was living in India at a Buddhist monastery there, and I went out, and somebody saw me and identified me as a Buddhist monk, and he came up very anxious. Is it true that you Buddhists don't accept the idea of the Atman? The real self? And I said, yes. And he was really worried and agitated. Then what about myself? What about myself? And we were standing, if I remember correctly, right outside the Bangalore mental hospital. I thought, I have to be careful. As if I undermine this person's real strong attachment to the belief in self, he might wind up there. Okay, so the Buddha uses his argument first with the 6. Well, actually, he goes taking each domain of experience. So first the eye, then forms, eye consciousness, eye contact, then feeling, then craving, the craving based on the visual experience. So all of this, he uses the same argument. Therefore, it is not valid, not tenable to say, this is the self. And then he repeats the same argument with the domain of the ear, sounds, nose, odors. The ear, sound, nose, odors, tongue, flavors. Then goes to the body, tangibles, mind objects, till we come through all of these 6 sixes, and the same argument applies that if you say, this is myself, then you also admit that this so-called self arises and passes away. Then you'll find yourself stuck with the conclusion, myself arises and passes away. But you want to maintain, or we share the assumption that the self is something persistent or permanent. And if you say the self is persistent and permanent, and yet you say that the thing identified as self arises and passes away, then you get yourself locked into a self-contradiction. The only way to escape that self-contradiction is to drop the identification of this is myself and recognize this is not the self. Let's see if we could represent this schematically. Okay, so I put in brackets what I call the premise that's shared both by the Buddha and by the person that he's arguing with or discussing with. The premise is that the self, the idea of self, includes the idea or implies the idea of persistence or permanence. So if there's anything that's truly the self, it must be persistent or permanent. Okay, so the opponent says X is the self. Could be any of the 5 aggregates, it could be any of the 6 sense bases, or so on. Okay, so the Buddha then replies, look at what you identify as self. We're calling X. This arises and passes away. Okay, from that, it would then follow, if you say X is the self, it follows that the self arises and passes away. But the self must be persistent, permanent, which means it doesn't arise and pass away. So therefore, what you are identifying as self is actually not self. Does that seem to work? And one thing that we have to be careful, this was like an early generation of maybe European and some English interpreters of Buddhism back in the early 20th century would say, the Buddha was trying to point in the same direction as the thinkers of the Vedanta or the Upanishads to affirm the self, but in a negative way, to say that all of these things are not self, because the true self is what stands behind all of this, permanent, everlasting, indescribable, inconceivable.
One might mistakenly understand Nibbana as that.
Yeah, mistakenly, yeah. But the Buddha never speaks about the self in that way at all, and never gives any indication that he's pointing to a kind of permanent, everlasting self. He does speak about, usually he uses the word unconditioned, deathless, ageless, changeless, imperishable state, reality, condition, which is Nibbana. But he never speaks about that as the self or the true self. Because in the Buddha's sort of domain of discourse, whatever the idea of self already includes a kind of inherent clinging or grasping, a quest, excuse me, a quest for some kind of identity. And so the Buddha doesn't affirm the idea of self, even this kind of metaphysical, indescribable, inconceivable self. But he approaches realization through the investigation of the nature of phenomena, to see them all as being non-self, and thereby breaking the identification with them. I speak about, I'll call this appropriation, which means taking possession, claiming this is mine, and identification, thinking this is what I am. And so by showing that these things are not self, not to be identified as self, he breaks the identification and breaks the appropriation, the possession. And that is what leads to realization and release. Yeah. Maybe take the mobile microphone.
Everything rises and passes, we understand that, but the Buddha states that when he becomes enlightened and there's no more coming or going, what state is it in? Is it a permanent state of nirvana? Because if you permanent, then there's a self. So now you're stating that if you everything passes in, there's no self since everything passes, right?
Yeah.
Rises and passes. So it is a form of permanent.
A form of
Permanent. Isn't it permanent, becoming enlightened? Nirvana?
nirvana.
Coming and going, so.
Yeah, nirvana itself, nibbana, is permanent, without coming, without going. But enlightenment, becoming enlightened, is itself an event. It's a conditioned event. You know, it's an event that takes place, in the case of the Buddha, on a particular night under the Bodhi tree. So the event took place and it came to an end, but the Buddha's state of enlightenment, I mean, it lasted through his life, but it's not.
So X is not always not self in that state of enlightenment.
Let us say that the Buddha's experience, even as an enlightened one, is still made up of 5 aggregates. So he has bodily form, feelings, perceptions, mental activities, consciousness.
Okay.
Those 5 aggregates are always arising and passing away. So they are not self. Mm-hmm. But the Buddha underwent a certain transformation, so that that transformation is irreversible, but it's not a permanent entity that remains. It's not a permanent entity that could be identified as self, but it's rather a transformed condition which persists through the changing of the 5 aggregates. I don't know if
Yeah,
that.
but then again, I mean, if it says a God is permanent, then we know that is, well, based on the Buddhist terms, there's no such thing as a permanent God. They all, I mean, there's no self there, there's none.
Yeah.
But by becoming enlightened, you're saying that that stops. It's no longer rising and passing.
No, as long as the enlightened person is alive, the experience is always arising and
Of course, I
passing
know,
away.
right. But I mean in the state of already enlightenment, when it's already enlightened and moves on after, death.
Yeah. Yeah, that becomes a permanent state, but
Right.
there's
That's what
no
I'm trying to say.
five
Right.
aggregates are
That's
not
my
there
question,
anymore.
right, okay.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, Anna had a question. Then we'll have to break for the lunch, but we come back.
So this holds if the premise is that the self has to be persistent and permanent.
Yeah.
Is there a way of conceiving of a self
Yeah.
that's subject to deterioration and instability? Or if that is the case, it is de facto not the self?
This is the way the self would have been understood within the Indian thought system in the Buddha's time. As I said, now when the Buddha is speaking in the when he's speaking in the ethical domain of discourse, he'll use the word self, referring to the person, the individual, not taking it in the metaphysical way as a persistent, permanent entity, but in the sense that we each have our own concrete personalities, our own individual identity. In that sense, the Buddha will use the word self affirmatively in order he'll use the word of self affirmatively as a spur to the sense of personal responsibility, moral responsibility, as a spur to personal effort to realize the goal of his teaching.
And the Pali word is the same in both cases?
It's the same word. It's the word atta, or there's the Sanskrit atma.
But, okay, so this is self as Atman.
Yeah. But he's not using the word Atman in the Upanishadic
He's using
sense
atta.
of the permanent, stable, unchanging.
So I guess what I'm saying, and pardon me if I'm belaboring the point, but who's to say that the self has to be persistent and permanent? Why can't it be impermanent and unstable and deteriorating, yet still a self?
One could use the word self in any way, sort of redefine it, but this was the way the self was conceived within the thought world of the India during the Buddha's time. And I also say that at a deep psychological level, this is the way we conceive our own identity. Like we're always sort of grasping on things that we can take to be permanent or stable with the hope that this will preserve our personal identity.
Yeah, I guess my question is that realizing this obliterates the idea of a permanent and persistent self, for sure.
Yeah.
But does it obliterate that sense of self that's subject to impermanence and deterioration? That still remains.